On the morning of July 1st, 1916, as the sun rose over the rolling fields of northern France, tens of thousands of young men climbed out of their trenches, believing the worst was already over. For 7 days, the British artillery had pounded the German lines without pause. Officers assured their men that nothing could have survived such destruction. The wire would be cut, the enemy would be dead or fleeing. All that remained, they were told, was to walk forward and claim victory. What happened next would become one of the darkest chapters in military history. If you enjoy these war journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought in the comments below. This helps others find their way here too. For now, let's begin our journey. This is the story of the Battle of the Somme, a battle defined not by swift triumph, but by unimaginable loss, mechanical slaughter, and decisions that reshaped how wars would be fought forever. Over the next hours, days, and months, nearly 3 million men would be thrown into a single campaign. More than 1 million would be wounded or killed. Entire towns would lose a generation, and the world would finally understand what industrialized war truly meant. The Battle of the Somme was not just a battle, it was a warning. By the summer of 1916, World War I had already devoured Europe for nearly 2 years. The Western Front had frozen into a vast, muddy scar stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Trench lines faced each other across a desolate strip of land known as no man's land, often only a few hundred meters wide. Every major offensive so far had ended the same way: massive casualties, minimal gains, and no decisive breakthrough. The Somme offensive was born out of desperation. France was bleeding to death at Verdun. Since February, German forces had been grinding the French army down in a battle explicitly designed to bleed France white. By June, French casualties were catastrophic. The British, still relatively new to large-scale continental warfare, were pressured into launching a massive offensive to relieve the French and force Germany to divert troops away from Verdun. The chosen battlefield lay along the River Somme, a quiet agricultural region of gentle hills, small villages, and open farmland. It was not strategically vital in the traditional sense, but it was where British and French armies met, and therefore where they could strike together. The plan was ambitious, rigid, and deeply flawed. British commanders believed that overwhelming artillery fire could destroy German defenses entirely. For a full week, more than 1.5 million shells were fired at German positions. The bombardment was so intense that it could be heard across the English Channel. Soldiers in the trenches believed nothing could survive it. But the German army had prepared well. Deep beneath the earth, reinforced concrete bunkers protected machine gun crews. Dugouts reached depths of up to 10 meters. When the shelling began, German soldiers simply went underground. When it stopped, they climbed back up, manned their weapons, and waited. At 7:30 a.m. on July 1st, the whistles blew. Along a front nearly 25 kilometers wide, British soldiers rose from their trenches and advanced at a walking pace. Many carried over 30 kilograms of equipment. Some units were ordered not to run, but to walk in formation, believing speed was unnecessary against a supposedly destroyed enemy. Within minutes, the truth revealed itself. German machine guns opened fire with devastating efficiency. Fields that moments earlier were filled with advancing lines of men became killing grounds. Soldiers fell in rows, mown down before they could even reach the first line of barbed wire, wire that in many places remained completely intact. In some sectors, entire battalions were wiped out within less than 10 minutes. By nightfall on the first day alone, the British Army had suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, over 19,000 dead. It remains the bloodiest day in the history of the British military. The French, attacking in the southern sector with more limited objectives and better artillery coordination, achieved some success, but it was overshadowed by the catastrophe unfolding to the north. The Somme had begun not as a breakthrough, but as a massacre. One of the haunting facts about the Somme is who fought there. This was not a professional army hardened by years of conflict. Much of the British force consisted of volunteers, men who had answered the call in 1914, encouraged by patriotic posters, speeches, and social pressure. They were factory workers, clerks, teachers, miners, and students. Many had joined together in what became known as PALS battalions, units formed from the same towns, neighborhoods, and workplaces. The idea was simple. Men would be more willing to enlist if they could serve alongside friends and family. The consequences were devastating. When a PALS battalion was destroyed, an entire community felt the loss at once. In towns across Britain, telegrams arrived by the dozens. Streets went silent. Schools lost teachers. Factories lost skilled workers. Football teams lost entire lineups. In some villages, nearly every household mourned. The Somme didn't just kill soldiers, it hollowed out society.
Despite the catastrophic first day, the offensive did not stop. Commanders believed that persistence would bring results. Attacks continued throughout July, August, and into November. Each assault followed a familiar pattern: artillery bombardment, infantry advance, machine gun fire, heavy casualties, minimal territorial gain. The battlefield itself transformed into something unrecognizable. Shell holes filled with water and corpses. Trees were reduced to splintered stumps. Villages like Thiepval, Pozières, and Beaumont-Hamel were erased from the map, fought over repeatedly for ruins that offered no shelter and little strategic value. The dead often lay where they fell, sometimes for weeks. Rain turned the ground into thick mud that swallowed men, horses, and equipment. Wounded soldiers drowned in shell holes. Stretcher bearers struggled for hours to move the injured just a few hundred meters. The smell of decay hung permanently in the air. For those fighting there, the Somme became a world unto itself, a nightmare landscape where time blurred, fear became constant, and survival felt arbitrary. Yet within this hell, the battle also marked moments of profound change. On September 15, 1916, something new appeared on the battlefield. As the morning mist lifted near the village of Flers-Courcelette, German soldiers saw large armored shapes emerging from the fog. They moved slowly, crushing barbed wire beneath their tracks and firing as they advanced. Some broke down almost immediately, others veered off course, but the psychological impact was enormous. These were the first tanks ever used in combat. Though crude and unreliable, tanks represented a revolutionary idea, a machine capable of crossing no man's land, surviving machine gun fire, and supporting infantry. While they did not deliver a decisive breakthrough at the Somme, they hinted at the future of warfare, a future where mobility and armor would challenge the dominance of trenches. The Somme was not only a battlefield of death, it was a laboratory of modern war. By the time the offensive finally ended in November 1916, the Allies had advanced roughly 10 kilometers at the deepest point. The cost was staggering: over 1 million casualties. The exact numbers remain debated, but the scale of loss is undeniable. And yet, in the cold logic of war, commanders claimed the Somme had achieved its goals. German forces had been weakened, pressure on Verdun had eased, the British Army had gained experience, hard lessons written in blood. For the soldiers who survived, those justifications meant little. What they carried home were memories of endless shelling, the screams of the wounded, and the faces of friends who never left the mud of northern France. Many would suffer from what was then called shell shock, their minds permanently scarred by what they had witnessed. The Somme left marks not only on maps, but on the human psyche. And this was only the beginning, because the Battle of the Somme holds far more than a single day of horror or a single failed plan. It contains stories of impossible survival, overlooked victories, brutal mistakes, and moments that quietly reshaped the course of the war. The battle did not pause to mourn the dead of July 1st. As bodies were still being gathered from the fields, as wounded men cried out from shell holes, the machinery of the Somme continued to turn. For the High Command, the catastrophe of the first day was not a signal to stop, but a problem to be corrected through persistence. The belief remained that the German army was close to collapse, that one more push, one more barrage, one more sacrifice would finally crack the line. So the men went forward again. Day after day, the same ground was attacked repeatedly. Thiepval Ridge, a natural defensive position overlooking much of the battlefield, became one of the most fiercely contested areas of the entire war. German positions there were layered, reinforced, and supported by overlapping machine gun fire. British units advanced under artillery cover only to be shredded as soon as the barrage lifted. Gains were measured not in kilometers, but in meters. A trench captured in the morning might be lost again by nightfall. The fighting quickly became a battle of attrition in its purest form. German doctrine emphasized defense in depth. Even when frontline trenches were overrun, secondary and tertiary lines allowed counterattacks to reclaim lost ground. British soldiers often found themselves trapped in newly captured positions, under fire from multiple directions, with little ammunition and no clear way to retreat. Survival depended as much on luck as on skill. The battlefield itself was now an active enemy.
Constant shelling obliterated landmarks, making navigation nearly impossible. Compasses malfunctioned due to metal debris. Maps became useless within hours. Men advanced toward objectives that no longer existed or wandered into deadly crossfire zones without realizing it. At night, patrols disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by craters and wire. One of the most disturbing realities of the Somme was how quickly death became normalized. Letters home spoke less of fear and more of exhaustion. Soldiers described stepping over bodies as casually as stepping over fallen branches. Some wrote of recognizing friends only by scraps of uniform or personal equipment. Others stopped writing altogether, unable to put the experience into words. Morale became a fragile thing. Yet, amid the carnage, acts of extraordinary courage occurred constantly. Stretcher bearers moved through open fire to rescue the wounded. Junior officers led repeated assaults despite knowing the odds. Medics worked non-stop, amputating limbs, treating gas injuries, and trying to keep men alive in conditions that defied sanitation or rest. The Somme revealed both the worst and best of humanity at the same time. As July dragged into August, the character of the battle slowly shifted. The German army, once confident behind its defenses, began to feel the strain. Constant artillery fire wore down positions. Replacements arrived exhausted, often younger and less trained. Supplies became harder to move forward under relentless shelling. The British, too, were changing. Hard lessons were learned in real time. Infantry tactics evolved. Units began using smaller, more flexible formations instead of rigid lines. Artillery coordination improved, with creeping barrages designed to move forward just ahead of advancing troops, suppressing enemy fire. Communication, though still primitive, adapted through signal flares, runners, and field telephones when lines were not cut. These changes came at an enormous cost, but they mattered. One of the most brutal engagements of the Somme took place at Pozières, a small village sitting on high ground. Australian forces were ordered to capture and hold it. What followed was weeks of relentless bombardment. German artillery targeted the area continuously, turning the village into a churned wasteland. Veterans later described Pozières as the most intense artillery fire they experienced in the entire war. Men slept in shallow holes scraped into the ground, surrounded by corpses. Shells fell so frequently that there were moments of silence only when the guns paused to reload. Casualties mounted rapidly, but the position was held. Pozières became a symbol of endurance and of the terrible price paid for limited tactical gains. By September, the Somme had consumed entire divisions on both sides. Fresh troops were thrown in to replace shattered units. The faces in the trenches changed, but the conditions did not. Rain returned, turning the battlefield into deep mud. Movement slowed. Equipment jammed. Wounded men were harder to evacuate. It was in this environment that tanks made their debut. Their appearance caused confusion and fear among German defenders, some of whom fled or surrendered at the sight of these armored machines. But mechanical failures plagued the early models. Many broke down before reaching the front. Others became stuck in mud or were disabled by artillery. Infantry support was inconsistent and coordination remained difficult. Still, tanks demonstrated something crucial: the possibility of breaking the stalemate. Even when they failed tactically, they succeeded psychologically. They forced commanders on both sides to rethink the future of warfare. The Somme was no longer just a grinding battle. It was a turning point in military innovation. For the German army, the Somme was a slow hemorrhage. While their casualties were comparable to the Allies, Germany lacked the same reserves of manpower. Each loss was harder to replace. Units rotated out of the line shattered, their combat effectiveness diminished. The myth of German invincibility began to crack. Yet the cost to the Allies remained staggering. British medical services were overwhelmed. Field hospitals overflowed. Trains carried wounded men back to ports, where ships ferried them across the Channel. Many never recovered physically or mentally. The concept of shell shock, though poorly understood at the time, became impossible to ignore. Men shook uncontrollably, were unable to speak, or collapsed without visible injury. The Somme forced society to confront the invisible wounds of war. At home, the tone of propaganda shifted. Early optimism faded, replaced with grim determination. Lists of casualties grew longer. Families waited anxiously for news, knowing that silence could mean survival or death. By October, the offensive ground on under worsening conditions. Cold winds swept across the exposed landscape. Frost formed in the mornings. Men huddled in wet uniforms, suffering from trench foot and disease. Supplies were delayed. Food arrived cold, if at all. And still, the attacks continued. The final phase of the Somme saw limited advances, often against exhausted defenders. Villages like Le Transloy and the heights beyond were taken, not through brilliance, but through relentless pressure. By November, it became clear that winter would soon make further operations impossible. On November 18, 1916, the offensive was finally halted. What remained was a devastated region, a traumatized generation, and a legacy that would echo long after the guns fell silent. The Somme did not deliver the decisive breakthrough its planners had promised, but it changed the war nevertheless. It drained German strength, accelerated tactical evolution, and forced every army involved to confront the realities of modern industrial conflict. And yet, for all its scale, the Somme is remembered not for victory or defeat, but for its human cost. Because behind every statistic was a man who walked forward believing the war might end that day, and instead vanished into the mud, smoke, and memory of one of history's most devastating battles. And there is still more to uncover, because within the chaos of the Somme lie stories rarely told, moments of survival against impossible odds, decisions that sealed the fate of thousands, and consequences that would shape the rest of the war and the world that followed.
As the guns fell silent in November 1916, the Battle of the Somme did not truly end for those who had fought it. The ground lay frozen and scarred, but the consequences of what had happened there were only beginning to unfold. Survivors carried the Somme with them, in their bodies, in their memories, and in the way they would fight future battles. What had been learned in blood would shape the remainder of the war. For many soldiers, leaving the Somme felt unreal. Men who had lived for months under constant shell fire struggled to adapt to quiet rear areas. Some reported that the silence itself was unsettling. Others woke at night expecting explosions that never came. The war had rewired their senses. What once would have been unbearable had become normal. The psychological toll of the Somme was unprecedented. Doctors observed symptoms they could not fully explain. Soldiers trembled uncontrollably, stared blankly, or became unable to follow simple commands. Some collapsed under stress without any visible wound. Others wandered aimlessly after bombardments, unable to remember who they were or where they belonged. The term shell shock entered common use, though understanding lagged far behind reality. Many victims were accused of cowardice rather than treated, punished instead of helped. The Somme exposed the limits of human endurance. Strategically, the battle forced both sides to confront hard truths. For the British Army, the Somme was a brutal education. It revealed the deadly cost of outdated tactics and blind faith in artillery alone. Commanders gradually accepted that success required combined arms: infantry, artillery, engineering, air reconnaissance, and eventually armor working together. The rigid doctrines of 1914 were dying in the mud of northern France. Air power, still in its infancy, played a growing role. Observation aircraft directed artillery fire and photographed enemy positions. Control of the skies became increasingly important. The Somme witnessed fierce aerial combat as both sides fought for reconnaissance dominance. Pilots like Manfred von Richthofen, the future Red Baron, gained early experience during this period. The sky above the Somme became another battlefield. On the ground, the German army underwent its own transformation. Defensive tactics evolved into elastic defense, allowing frontline units to give ground temporarily while preparing counterattacks from stronger positions behind. This adaptation would make future Allied offensives even more costly. The Somme had taught Germany how to survive, but at a terrible price. One of the most significant yet often overlooked outcomes of the Somme was its impact on leadership. British High Command faced growing criticism. The scale of casualties shocked the public and strained trust between soldiers and their generals. While some commanders adapted and learned, others clung to flawed assumptions. The debate over whether the Somme was a necessary sacrifice or a tragic failure began almost immediately, and it has never fully ended. For the men at the front, those arguments felt distant. What they remembered were the small moments: sharing cigarettes in a shell hole, writing letters by candlelight, laughing at dark jokes to survive another night. Camaraderie became a lifeline. In a landscape of death, friendship was often the only thing that felt real. Some soldiers recorded their experiences in diaries and letters, leaving behind vivid first-hand accounts. They wrote of fear before an attack, of relief when it was postponed, of guilt at surviving when others did not. These personal testimonies reveal the Somme not as a single battle, but as millions of individual experiences layered atop one another. No two men fought the same Somme. The battlefield itself continued to claim lives even after the fighting ended. Unexploded shells littered the ground. Men were killed months later while clearing debris or repairing trenches. Farmers returning to their land after the war would face danger for decades. Even today, munitions from the Somme are discovered annually, a reminder that the past is not as distant as it seems. Entire villages had ceased to exist. Some were rebuilt, others were left as memorials. The landscape of northern France was permanently altered, its scars still visible from the air. Cemeteries spread across the region, rows upon rows of white headstones marking where the dead had fallen. Many graves bore no names. The Somme became synonymous with loss on an almost unimaginable scale. For Britain, it marked the moment the war lost any illusion of glory. For Germany, it represented a slow weakening that would contribute to eventual defeat.
For France, it was part of the long, grinding struggle to survive. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Somme is how little ground changed hands compared to the cost. After 5 months of fighting, the Allied advance measured only a few miles. In any other context, such a gain would be meaningless. At the Somme, it came soaked in blood. And yet, historians continue to debate its significance. Some argue the Somme was necessary, that it broke German momentum, saved Verdun, and laid the foundation for later Allied success. Others see it as a tragic example of poor leadership and industrialized slaughter. Both views contain truth. The Somme was neither meaningless nor victorious. It was a collision between old thinking and modern war, and humanity paid the price. For those who lived through it, the Somme never truly ended. Veterans carried the weight of the years that followed. Many struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. Noise, crowds, and sudden movements triggered memories of bombardment. Nightmares persisted. Families often did not understand what their sons, husbands, or fathers had endured. The war had changed them, and the world they returned to was changing too. The Somme influenced literature, art, and collective memory. Writers who had fought there or lost friends there began to question nationalism, authority, and the very nature of war itself. The romantic ideals of the 19th century gave way to a colder, more disillusioned view of the modern age. In this way, the Somme reshaped culture as much as it reshaped military doctrine. Yet, despite all of this, the battle still holds stories rarely told, of unlikely survival, of moments when fate turned on a single step, a delayed order, or a misfired shell. These are the stories that revealed the human dimension behind the statistics.
By the end of 1916, the Battle of the Somme had already begun to slip from the realm of immediate news into something heavier and more permanent: memory. For those who planned it, the Somme became a subject of reports, maps, and statistics. For those who fought it, it became something far more intimate, a place they would revisit for the rest of their lives, whether they wanted to or not. Long after the guns stopped firing, veterans spoke of the Somme as if it were alive. They described it as a presence that followed them home, that surfaced in dreams, in sudden flashes of sound or smell, in moments of silence that felt too deep. Many said the war ended on paper in 1918, but for them it had truly ended in the mud of northern France 2 years earlier. Everything after the Somme felt like borrowed time. One of the most striking facts about the battle is how profoundly it changed the men who survived, and how little society was prepared to understand that change. Governments celebrated endurance and sacrifice, but offered few answers for broken minds and bodies. Shell-shocked soldiers were often discharged quietly, sent home without recognition. Some were institutionalized, others turned inward, unable to explain what they had seen or done. The Somme created a generation of men who had stared directly into industrialized death and were expected to resume normal life as if nothing had happened. Normal no longer existed. In military terms, the Somme marked the end of illusion. No commander after 1916 could claim ignorance of what modern war demanded. Massed infantry assaults without coordination were no longer seen as brave, but wasteful. Artillery, air power, intelligence, logistics, and combined arms became central to planning. The seeds planted in the chaos of the Somme would later grow into the coordinated offensives of 1918. Even tanks, clumsy and unreliable at first, would evolve rapidly. By the final year of the war, they would spearhead breakthroughs rather than merely frighten defenders. The Somme had shown what was possible and what was necessary. In this sense, the battle was not an end, but a brutal beginning. For Germany, the Somme was a wound that never fully healed. Though German forces held much of their ground, the cost was unsustainable. Experienced soldiers and junior officers were lost in large numbers. Morale suffered. The army that emerged from the Somme was still disciplined and dangerous, but it was no longer invincible. The slow erosion that began there would continue until the collapse of 1918. The German High Command understood this, even if it was never publicly admitted. Defensive tactics improved, but the strategic balance was shifting. The Allies could replace losses more easily. The war was becoming one of endurance, and Germany was losing that contest. The Somme did not defeat Germany outright, but it shortened the road to defeat. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Somme lies not in strategy, but in memory. Cemeteries across the former battlefield stretch to the horizon, row after row of identical headstones. Names repeat, ages are heartbreakingly young. Many markers simply read, "Known unto God." These are not monuments to victory, but to loss. Every one of those graves represents a story that ended there. Some soldiers were buried where they fell, their remains never recovered. Others were identified decades later, sometimes through fragments of uniform or personal effects. Even today, remains from the Somme are occasionally discovered, a silent reminder that the war is not as distant as it seems. The land itself remembers. Farmers still uncover rusted helmets, rifles, and unexploded shells. Entire areas remain restricted due to buried munitions. The Somme is one of the most dangerous battlefields in history, even more than a century later. And yet, the Somme is not remembered for death only. It is remembered because it forced humanity to confront itself. It exposed the consequences of blind optimism, rigid thinking, and the belief that courage alone could overcome machine guns and artillery. It showed the limits of patriotism when tested against steel, fire, and mathematics. It revealed how quickly modern societies could mobilize not just armies, but entire populations, and how devastating that mobilization could be. The Somme shattered the romantic image of war forever. After 1916, no one who understood the battle could speak honestly about war as an adventure. It was understood instead as a grinding, impersonal force that consumed lives indiscriminately. This realization would echo through the rest of the 20th century, influencing how future wars were fought and how they were remembered. For historians, the Somme remains a subject of debate.
Was it necessary? Was it mismanaged? Could it have been avoided? There are no simple answers. The commanders operated under pressures and assumptions shaped by their time. They faced an enemy that had to be stopped, an ally that needed relief, and a strategic stalemate that demanded action. But understanding context does not erase consequence. The men who died at the Somme paid the price for decisions made far from the front. What remains undeniable is the scale of sacrifice and the responsibility to remember it accurately, without glorification and without forgetting. The Battle of the Somme stands as one of the defining events of World War I, not because of what it achieved on a map, but because of what it revealed about war itself. It showed that modern conflict was no longer about swift victories or heroic charges. It was about endurance, machinery, and the ability to absorb loss on an industrial scale. It was about systems, not individuals, even though individuals suffered the consequences. In that sense, the Somme was a turning point, not just in military history, but in human history. As you reflect on what you've just witnessed, the decisions, the suffering, the endurance, and the cost, remember that the Somme was not fought by abstract numbers, but by real people. People who believed they were doing their duty. People who hoped they would see home again. People whose lives were forever shaped by a few miles of devastated ground in northern France. If you made it to the end of this documentary, leave a comment sharing what struck you most about the Battle of the Somme, and include the keyword Somme so we know you stayed until the final moment. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and keep watching the other war documentaries appearing on your screen now, because history does not end here, and neither does this story.